Good day. Before I proceed with this video, this is a quick reminder that if you're watching this video on Rumble, or if you're watching any of our other videos on Rumble, that is to say videos by the Duran, by Alexander Mercouris, or by Alex Cristoforo, then if you go to the top of the video, you will see a red maroon button. If you press that button, that will take you directly to our Locals homepage, where you can join our active Locals community. And if you choose to become an active member, you can then participate in my Wednesday live streams, which take place every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, and put questions to me if you so choose. And of course, you can also publish on Locals your own exclusive content and publish comments on the content published by others. Well, this video is going to be a relatively short one. It is going to be about the presidential election in France. And my immediate reaction when I saw the result is that it's a case of plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they remain the same. What this election demonstrates yet again is the extraordinary structural rigidities within not just French society, but indeed European society, which make it incredibly difficult, perhaps realistically impossible, to change policy in any major European state, despite the fact that the policies that are being followed are inimical to very large sections of the European public, and indeed in France and the French public, are widely unpopular, are associated with politicians who are also unpopular, and are recognized by many people as leading Europe, and in this case France, into a blind alley. Consider Emmanuel Macron, the incumbent president, is, as I can vouch for myself, deeply unpopular in France. He has presided over a very weak economic inheritance, despite massive spending. Growth in France has only been around 1% in the years that he has been president. Most of his so-called reforms have been of a kind that are unpopular with the French people, and they've not made any fundamental difference to the underlying French economic problems. There is therefore a widespread sense of malaise in France, with an aloof, arrogant, unpopular, and out of touch president. And yet, in spite of that, in this election, he won the election convincingly with 58% of the vote. Now, that is remarkable, and I have to say that I do take issue with Marine Le Pen's claim that the 42% she won in this election is some kind of victory. Certainly, she has done a lot better than she did in the previous election, when she only won 34%, and the gain of 8 percentage points that she's achieved is progress of a sort. But given how bad the situation is in France, you would have expected her to do better. And indeed, some of the opinion polls in the weeks running up to the election suggested that she would do better still. Moreover, one can't really argue that what she did during the second round would have lost her support. My overall impression was that she put in a creditable performance in the television debate, and she didn't make any particular big missteps. By contrast, Macron came across to me, at least, as arrogant and condescending, and frankly, I didn't see much evidence of his famed debating skills. And yet, in spite of a lackluster performance from Macron and Le Pen raising her game, as I said, Macron still won by a margin of 16%, which seems to me to be a decisive margin. So why has this happened? Well, it is because of that legacy of the past, of those structural rigidities that beset France to an extreme degree, but which are to be found to a greater or lesser extent in every European country. Le Pen has been labelled in France as far right. Now, in my opinion, that is a completely meaningless label. I don't entirely understand what it even is supposed to mean. All I would say is that in terms of her stated policies, which are, by the way, likely to be different from what her actual policies would be were she ever elected, when I personally expect that she would moderate her policies even more. But in terms of her stated policies, I don't think that they differ very much from the stated policies on immigration, on economics, on all kinds of other things of the current Conservative government in Britain. Now, I say that, again, with the important qualification that the stated policies of the British Conservative government on all these issues are actually very different from what the stated policies are. But I'm simply making parallels here between the stated policies of the British Conservative government, which nobody calls far right, and the stated policies of Marine Le Pen in France, whom everybody calls far right. And yet, because this label has been stuck on her, she cannot win an election, or so it seems, because in every election, the centre and the left unite against her, however close she comes to winning, to achieving what looks like to be a political breakthrough. And this is incredibly ironic, because on every single point of policy that matters, Le Pen is actually closer to the positions of many people who I self-identify as left than she is to the centre, and then they are to the centre as well. There is much more in common between the economic policies of the left and the centre in France than there is on the part of the left and on the left and the right in France than the left and the right share with the centre. And I'm going to say, even on immigration policy, as I said, I expect a Le Pen presidency to be far more watered down on immigration than many people or would like to either expect or would like to expect. So the left and the centre, on the face of it, have far more in common than either does. Sorry, the left and the right have far more in common with each other on substantive policies than either does with the centre. And yet the mere fact that Le Pen is identified as far right is enough to mean that 42% of the voters who voted for Jean-Luc Mélenchon in the first round of the election voted for Macron in the second round, even though most of them detest Macron, and even though, as I said, Le Pen's policies ultimately are closer to those that those left-wing voters support than Macron's are. And I can't really see why, short of an economic collapse, things will be any different in the next presidential election in 5 years' time. Indeed, one could see that there would be factors in a future presidential election in 5 years' time that might actually work against Le Pen. After all, Macron will be gone by then. He can't stand for a third term. So who would probably run? The person who would probably run would be someone new, and quite plausibly that person would be packaged to the French as a breath of fresh air, a drastic change with the failed policies of the past, which is exactly what they did with Macron 5 years ago. And one can imagine that there would be French people who would either believe it or who would want to believe it as an excuse for not voting for Le Pen. So we see how Le Pen, as the main challenger to the status quo, always gets defeated by a Republican combination of the centre and the left, even though, as I said, the left actually shares much more with her in terms of policy than the left shares with the centre led by Macron. Now, the self-declared and in fact actual leader of the left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is now saying that what he wants is to his party, his new political formation, to win the parliamentary elections in June. And quite clearly, he's angling to become prime minister in a cohabitation arrangement with Macron. And that seems to have been his tactic and his strategy all along. He was careful not to tell his supporters to vote for Macron, but he told them not to vote for Le Pen. And as we see, large numbers of them have heeded him. So that seems to be his strategy. Le Pen, for her part, also wants to make big inroads in the legislative elections in June. I'm going to say something about this. I think Mélenchon's policy is overcomplicated and overambitious. And I suspect that what will happen is that with the legislative elections coming, many centrist voters who previously had voted, who in the presidential election voted for Macron, basically to keep Le Pen out, will now trickle back to the established parties, the Republicans and the Socialists, and perhaps to Macron's own En Marche party. And we could very well end up seeing a parliament, a French legislative assembly, which admittedly will probably have stronger representation from the left and from the right, but which will still, to a great extent, be controlled by the centre, which will continue to have enough votes to hold the balance. And I say that because after what Mélenchon has said in the elections, it is inconceivable that he could enter into coalition with Le Pen's National Rally. So unless his party were to win an outright majority, which I think is unlikely, he would have to go into coalition with centrist parties, ultimately connected to Macron, if he were indeed to become prime minister. And that would inevitably mean that he would not be able to carry through with his radical program, the radical program that he has promoted and which has won him so much support amongst younger people in France, especially. One can very easily see how this could all turn out into a trap for him. So what we could very well end up after this whole process is concluded is with a French president, Macron, who is the same president as we saw previously, and a French parliament, which isn't actually fundamentally different from the one we have at the moment, even if the configuration of parties is different, one which would still essentially support the status quo, and with a left-wing political leader, Mélenchon, who might find that his strategies are not going to be as effective as he imagines. And that is a tragedy for France. It's a tragedy for Europe as well. It is a further sign of how what I call Merkelism, Angela Merkel's strategy of governing everything from the centre, of tilting sometimes to the left, sometimes to the right, as the eddies and currents of politics flow around the political lake in Europe, how that continues to in European policy, and how, of course, what it results in is not movement, it is immobilism and ultimately stagnation. Of course, it works very well for the centre in Brussels, which continues to take more and more power from the states, but it means that effective challenges to the Brussels centre from the states is simply not able to cohere, even though, as we've seen in a country like France, the policies that the centre is imposing are deeply unpopular. Unless and until this changes, unless and until right and left, or what call themselves right and left in countries like France, are prepared to put the past behind them, go beyond the policies, the political structures that were created by the French Revolution and the centuries that followed, leading all the way up to the Second World War, I'm sorry to say, I think we will continue to see plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they remain the same. And that, unfortunately, leads to a bleak outcome for Europe, for France, for all European countries, one that I suspect more and more people up across Europe are starting to sense, but which these ideological barriers make it almost impossible for them to break, to end, with these ideological barriers being, in effect, Europe's own self-created prison. So a bleak election in France, one which suggests little real movement, either in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in any of the big European countries, with everything going round in circles and nothing substantive ever being done. Well, thank you for joining me for this rather bleak perspective on Europe. I hope you'll join me nonetheless again in future programs on this channel. Look forward to you doing so. In the meantime, remember you can find us on other platforms. I mentioned Rumble and Locals at the start of this program, but you can also find us on channels like Super U and others as well. And of course, don't forget you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop and buying the amazing things that you will find there. And last but not least, by ticking the like button to this video if you've liked this analysis, bleak as it is, and by checking your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day until then.